Welcome back. We are joined again by Colonel Douglas Macgregor, a decorated combat veteran and author and former advisor to the U.S. Secretary of Defense. Thank you for coming back on the program. I see now that Trump and Netanyahu has met in the White House. Trump appears to have expressed some concerns about the impacts on energy markets and the global economy of the Iran war, while Netanyahu appears to be pushing the idea that it's unlikely that a deal can be made with Iran. So what is necessary is more pressure through, well, economic pressure, but also military strikes. I was wondering, is there anything to be made of this meeting? Did it have any significance, or was this essentially the path we're still on?
Well, what we're hearing in terms of comments are what we refer to in English as boilerplate comments. We're not hearing anything that is particularly informative. I would say that we could reach sort of two or three conclusions. The first, unfortunately, is that Trump has once again decided not to decide anything when it comes to Ukraine. He listened to Zelensky. Obviously, he was told by his handlers that he should. He did. And they seem to have had an amicable meeting during which Zelensky wants to license the production of Patriot missiles in Ukraine, which will never happen. But by the time they did that, Ukraine won't exist anymore, in my estimation. And Trump indulged all of that nonsense and sort of waved goodbye. He's not going to stop the Congress from wasting money and time on Ukraine. So he's just not going to decide anything. It's disappointing, but I think this is something the Russians have become accustomed to. When you turn to Netanyahu showed up and I think privately said what he's always said. Now, today in the Wall Street Journal, there was an article about a 2-week plan that has been developed by Admiral Cooper that would result in another massive missile and bombing campaign that would theoretically have different results. And we continue to hear rumors about the use of ground forces, particularly against Karg Island and potentially Chabahar on the south coast of Iran. So I think whatever disagreements they may have had, I don't think there's any change in the larger direction strategically. And I have this sinking feeling that we are going to be attacking very shortly in a big way.
Well, some of these attacks, though, it appears that the escalation control is not quite there. You've seen the attacks on Iraq. I mean, this can have a lot of unforeseen consequences. The involvement of Yemen now in the war as well is deeply problematic. But, especially the folks, well, there's a lot of countries involved here. But which is it that concerns you the most now? I thought that the Iraq one, I think, is underestimated how bad this can go. But again, I'm not the expert here.
Well, I think we can conclude that a couple of things are underway, one of which is this is a regional war now. This is no longer limited to Israel and Iran and the United States. It has spilled over into, as you point out, Iraq. The Popular Mobilization Forces there, the PMF, are very loyal to the Iranians that stood by them through the Civil War and virtually from the beginning of our intervention and occupation. They have their eyes on Kuwait, frankly. I think Kuwait will cease to exist when this war ends. It'll become part of Iraq. I also think that this war is spreading even to places that we're not paying attention to. There was a refinery in Egypt that was badly damaged by an unmanned system. We're not quite sure where it came from. That could have come from Iraq or any number of places. Could have come from the Houthis. Al-Ansara is now in control of the access to the Red Sea. Iran controls access to the Persian Gulf. This basically is a clear and unambiguous message that the United States Navy no longer controls either of those, and for that matter, is no longer the dominant force they claim to be. I think the second piece, and this is the most important part, and this is what I think troubles Trump more than anything else. The loss of control over the flow of oil, the destruction of the global energy complex, those things are important. But to Donald Trump personally and to his inner circle, what's at stake right now is the survival of American military, political, and economic hegemony. That's what it's all about. You'll recall all these silly remarks about the rules-based liberal international order. Well, that thing was concocted in the aftermath of Bretton Woods and the International Monetary Fund, World Bank, the instrumentalities that were supposed to be helpful and good for people in the world, and people bought that for a while, and they finally realized, as Charles de Gaulle predicted, that everything that was being developed was really a Trojan horse for American hegemonic power. Well, that's true. And what has happened over the last 30 years, as the Russians have noted and others, is that this hegemonic power expanded. And it's reached a point of intolerability. In other words, people just won't tolerate it anymore. And the acid test for this military hegemony has been Iran. And the United States Armed Forces thus far have lost. And so for all intents and purposes, the world has concluded that the world they lived in of American military, political, and economic hegemony is over. So what is Trump really doing? Trump at this point is really fighting a rearguard action. He's trying to save whatever he can of this hegemony. The reason he went back to war after signing the MOU is that he finally realized, look, the MOU is unambiguous surrender of U.S. military hegemony. I can't afford that. I can't allow it to happen. Now you have all sorts of people saying, well, if this is allowed to stand, if we cannot defeat Iran, then others will challenge us. And years ahead, we will be targets. Iran will strike us and all this kind of crap. The possibility that most of the world will get on with itself, especially in the Eastern Hemisphere without us, doesn't seem to occur to anybody. We are now continuing to weaponize our economy, our financial system, sanctions upon sanctions directed at China, sanctions upon sanctions directed at Iran or directed at Russia, anybody that we don't like who challenges us. It's a dead end, Glenn. So I think we are rapidly approaching a turning point. Now, whether it's a turning point or we're just reaching entropy, I don't know. But if you look at the Russians right now, contrary to what people are saying in the West, they are advancing. And the Russian military is stronger today than at any time since the 1980s. More and more forces are being mobilized, trained, and equipped. And the Russian forces are now effectively blockading Odessa and Mykolaiv ports, shutting that off, turning what remains of Ukraine into a landlocked area. And Kiev is justifiably concerned that these so-called fortress cities are going to fall shortly. And that effectively opens the path to Dnipro, Kharkov, and Kiev. So Zelensky is worried. His government is decomposing, firing people left and right, people resigning, leaving. And at the same time, we've actually privately said to the Russians we'd like to talk, and apparently Minister Lavrov has said no thanks because he sees no evidence that we're really interested in bringing an end to the war. Then you turn to Israel. Israel is very happy that we abandoned the June Memorandum of Understanding. They simply want to keep the war going as long as possible because theirs is a war to the finish. They're in an existential war in their judgment, and they're correct right now. They've turned it into an existential war for Israel. Either they can exterminate and annihilate their enemies all over the region or not. They have complete control of us for the moment, and so they're confident that that can still be achieved. I'm not so sure it can, but that's what they think. And as long as we are obedient and do what they tell us to do, I guess you could say they're going to continue. So we're in for another massive air and missile strike scenario, another offensive. And the White House remains what I would call an Israeli or Jewish lobby policy-making center. And so that's why I say Trump listened, and I think Trump is going to obey. At the same time, we're still in a fight with the Chinese. Now, the potential for war there has receded. Everyone, months ago announced that we didn't have enough missiles and enough capability to attack China, and if we did, we'd lose it. For some reason, nobody bothered to say the same was true for Iran. This is a catastrophic outcome for Trump. And the other thing that Trump, I don't think, is aware, maybe he is, but we're now beginning to see the emergence of a new axis. We talk about these axes all the time. Well, there's only one axis in the West and the Middle East. That's the Israeli-American axis. But when you look east, you have a growing axis that I would say consists of Russia, China, Iran, and I would add Turkey. Because even though the Turks have not yet engaged, they are on the very edge of doing so. And the population there is overwhelmingly in support of striking back against this Israeli-American axis in the Middle East. I think Erdogan has waited as long as he possibly can and will continue to wait, but he wants to be in on the end. It's sort of like the Battle of Waterloo, which was largely a German affair with a few British troops, contrary to popular belief. Prussians, Hanoverians, and Germans from everywhere. And of course, the British. And then suddenly at the end, imagine the Austrians and the Russians and others showing up. Well, I think that will be Turkey at the end of this thing. Because Iran had to do two things. The first was survive. It's done that. It's demonstrated it cannot be destroyed. And it's going to continue to attack because the second goal for Iran, having survived, and they weren't sure that they would. They spent 20, 30 years preparing, but they were never completely sure. Now they know they're going to survive, is to drive the American military presence completely out of the region. And that's going to happen because we can't protect our own bases, let alone any of our partners. So that's going to be achieved. And at that point, this new axis that I just described is going to dominate. It's going to dominate the Middle East. It's going to dominate Eastern Europe, perhaps Western Europe, because people in Western Europe are looking at this and saying, well, why should we sign up for the United States? It's no longer the leading economic power. It no longer has the same political influence. Financially, it's brought us to ruin. We're part of this Western scam, recirculate all the dollars back through New York City, fund our massive debt so that we can continue to live well. Europeans are saying, what are we doing this for? And then finally, there's the military dimension. Europeans are beginning to question their governments because they're unsure about this Russian threat. And they should be unsure about it because it's not real, as we know. But I guess the possibility that you could end up in a nuclear confrontation with China, Pakistan, and Russia, let alone a confrontation that would also include Turkey and Iran, these things don't seem to really enter into discussion in the White House. And I think that's because right now, everything that is being done in the White House, everything that's being done on the Hill, is seen through the lens of the Israel lobby and the fight for Jewish supremacy in the Middle East, as well as in the United States and the West.
Yeah, no, definitely that's the impression you got from the meeting as well with Trump and Netanyahu, because everything kind of was framed a bit around how it benefits Israel. For one, Netanyahu apparently showed a map to a map to Trump, complaining that Turkey controls 50 times more territory in Syria than Israel, and well, essentially this is not fair. They won their larger spoils of war. And also with this nuclear deal between the United States and Saudi Arabia, Trump had apparently reassured Netanyahu that this would depend on Saudi Arabia normalizing relations with Israel. But again, this would put some proliferation pressures on Iran as well. So it looks as if a lot of poor decisions are being made to serve Israel. But how stable is now the situation for the Israelis? Because there's a lot of this reeks of desperation.
Well, of course it does. It's kind of interesting, though, because it's very reminiscent of the meeting in January of 1941 between Molotov and Hitler in Berlin. Molotov requested the meeting and came in with Stalin's demands. Not Stalin's recommendations or requests, Stalin's demands. Stalin demands control of the Bosporus, control of the Dardanelles. Stalin demands control of these areas in Romania and Bulgaria that adjoin the Dardanelles. Stalin demands control of Finland, you know, and Hitler sort of sat there and said, "My God, these people are crazy. They're threatening the whole world." And it was a very unsatisfactory meeting. Now, subsequently, some smart people on the German general staff tried to make the point that let Stalin do what he likes. If he does that, he'll be at war with the British Empire and everyone else because they can't accept these things. And that would work to our advantage. But foolish Hitler said, no, we have to defend civilization, the West, against the Soviets. Imagine that. The rest is history. You got a war. The problem I have with this meeting that you're just describing is Zelensky and Netanyahu are joined at the hip. They're both supported by the same groups of people. Let's be frank, the same groups of people that want to essentially denude the populations of the Middle East of Muslim Arabs and Christian Arabs and replace them with Jews are the same people that want to do something similar to Russia. So they are backing the Ukraine mess. And the bad news is that we don't seem to want to recognize that, and we're not willing to stand up to it because those same forces own everyone. Literally. I mean, how do you turn to people that have given you hundreds of millions of dollars, who have enriched you, who've helped you to win elections, who've kept you in power, kept you in office, even though their policies, many of them are really distasteful, both domestically as well as in foreign policy? I don't know. But I fear that this meeting is going to lead to a widening of the war, just as the meeting in January of 41 led to catastrophe. I think these meetings in Washington did not solve any problems. It didn't take us off the path of disaster. It's keeping us on it. And all we have to do is look at the global energy complex and look at the global economy, and we know that all of those things are plunging into the abyss. People here in the United States, and I think in Europe, don't realize we haven't even begun to feel the effects of the disrupted energy complex. It's going to get a lot worse. I look at the situation in Germany. VW is essentially committing Harry-Kari. It's on a suicidal path. I don't know how the German government can survive. This is a bad situation. And instead of leading us out of it, which is what Washington under Trump was supposed to do, we're marching right into it. So I don't, it's not so much that Trump is making any decisions. It's his failure to make the right decisions and extending these policies that will bring disaster to us and to Europe and to the Middle East.
Well, on that topic, though, the energy crisis, again, this is something that Trump brought up in his meeting with Netanyahu, but he also cited the concern about energy and global economy as the reason why he signed the MOU, which he then walked away from, well, pretty much as he signed it. But now, of course, the issue of Hormuz has not been solved. It's not going to be solved, it seems. We can add the Red Sea on top of this just to make it even more complicated. And we see these Saudi energy facilities being struck. And, well, you can add a lot of other crises on top of there. But energy prices don't seem to reflect the dire realities that you speak of. Again, I'm not contesting what you're saying. I'm just trying to make sense of how to understand the energy price, because it doesn't really make much sense. We can watch on TV the energy fields in Saudi Arabia burning at the same time. The oil prices are dropping. I'm just wondering, how do you make sense of this?
Well, there's a yawning gap between reality and fantasy in Wall Street. Wall Street is accustomed to manipulation. Remember, everything is financialized for Wall Street. You don't have people in Wall Street who've ever been to drilling rigs. You don't have people in Wall Street who have visited any refineries. If you ask one of them, how many refineries do we have today? How many refineries did we have 30 years ago? They have no idea. They don't see a problem. And the White House, thanks to the leadership of Trump and his inner circle of advisors, has been very effective at manipulating oil prices. But we know, for instance, that the cost of oil coming off a ship right now is about $140 a barrel. But that's not the paper price. This is all going to change. In other words, what you have right now, what's the right word? We talk about latency in communications of the military. That, as a result of the structure of your communications, orders or information or intelligence take time to arrive at a location. It's not instantaneous. Well, that's what you're dealing with right now in the oil market. So if you listen to Jeff Curry or somebody like Pilkington and others who have years of experience in the oil industry, they're all saying the same thing. Yeah, you're right. The reality hasn't caught up yet, but it will. And when it catches up this time around, it's going to be awful. Weeks ago we said, well, if President Trump steps out of this or puts an end to it, there's a chance we could get out of this with minimal damage. Two or 3 years, we could return to normalcy. But where we're headed right now, it'll be a decade or more. And everything is going to change. I mean, when you listen to the Iranians and others in the Middle East who are fundamentally opposed to us and Israel, they all say the same thing. Sykes-Picot is over. In other words, the structures of the past that were formulated at the end of the First World War are going away. We're going to live in a new Middle East, and it's not going to be one dominated. It's not going to be the Greater Israel Project. It's not going to be the United States. It's going to be indigenous. And the two great powers that are going to shape these things and decide these things are not the United States and Israel. They're primarily Iranians and Turks because they live there, but also Chinese and Russians, the Chinese especially, because they're the only country in the world that can help rebuild anything. We're broke. We're on the edge of a total financial meltdown. It's like a lot of things. You and I stand at the railroad crossing and we look out and we say, see, look over there. The train is coming. The locomotive is coming. And everybody says, oh, yeah, you've been saying that for the last 6 hours. It hasn't gotten here yet. Yeah, but we can see it now. It's visible. It's coming. Yeah, right. Fine. Yeah, wake me when it arrives. Well, it's going to arrive, Glenn. So, you can replay this at some point in the future. And the people that all said, oh, I'm crazy, Curry's crazy, all these other experts are crazy, all these other military analysts are crazy, replay it. And everybody will reel in shock. Well, why didn't we do something? That will be the question. Well, the man who has to do something is named Donald Trump. And it's not a question of what he's doing. It's a question of what he's failing to do. He's just decided not to decide. And that's why you get this vacillation every other day. I'm going to destroy them. I'll hit every bridge. Okay. What difference does that make? What are you going to do? Destroy every hospital? What's your plan? What targets are going to be so important? Are you going to, we're going to seize Carg Island. Oh, that'll be good. Great. Yeah. What are all those soldiers on Carg Island going to do as they sit under constant bombardment from the Iranians? It'll be an exercise in suicide and certain death. Okay, well, then we'll destroy Carg Island. Okay, now what? There's no sense of this whole thing makes no sense. And the intelligent thing to do is to stop it. There's not going to be a public surrender by us or by Iran. He's just going to have to disengage, and he will. He'll disengage, but not until the 11th hour and not until it's too late, and only when the economy here at home is awful and is really profoundly affecting everyone in Washington. That's coming. It's absolutely certainly coming. So I don't know what to tell you, except that President Trump does not fully appreciate the limits of American air and naval power. He never understood that our military power was always structured for relatively short campaigns against opponents like Afghanistan, Iraq, Syria, Africa, people without air and missile defenses, let alone operational strike capabilities in the form of ballistic missiles. So, in addition, we have to operate at a very long logistical support system, and that's very fragile. And that's one of the reasons we're in a pause right now. So this is not a new problem. We've been dealing with this, contrary to popular belief, since the Bush administration in 2001. But that's where we are, and Trump has never understood it, and he's now going to pay a terrible price for it, I predict, politically.
On your analogy, though, of the approaching train, there's another predictable disaster which nobody appears to want to acknowledge, which is the pending Russian victory. That is, I see, despite all evidence, our political media establishment still holds on to the narrative that the tide is turning in Ukraine and NATO's favor. But we now see, yeah, key territory collapsing. We see this speech by Putin, in which he has seems very confident. We hear from Moscow that they're quite angry and ready to take the gloves off. They have no trust more in diplomacy, which means that they will go for a very brutal victory instead. And I guess in this context, we now see General Surovikin, also known as General Armageddon, being reintroduced. I was wondering, what do you read into this?
Well, the last few days, we've had a speech by Putin to a very large audience inside the Kremlin, and another presentation with veterans, primarily naval officers, as I understand it, based on the uniforms. They were both important because President Putin signaled, that things are about to change. He pointed out that to this point, we have moved very methodically, deliberately, for various reasons. Obviously, this is probably the man in the history of Russia that is being most concerned about Russian lives of anyone I can think of over the last 1,000 years, which is a credit to him. But he pointed out that he said, I have had to be very cautious because of the economy. I wanted to preserve the structure of the economy, the standards of living, our prosperity. And we had to accept the fact that the buildup to the point where we are now with the kinds of forces that we have and capabilities would take time. He said, we've accomplished all those goals. We're doing very well. Frankly, all these sanctions that people in Washington love because they feel noble and moral for doing it are irrelevant and have had little to no impact on anybody. People have all learned how to circumvent these sanctions and get on with life, especially Russia. And he said, I've talked to veterans and they said, we need to be more bold. In other words, let's get on with this. Let's crush this enemy and be done with it. Then the next day he spoke, or I guess it may have been later on that day, he spoke with these veterans and he went further and he said, perhaps not this week or tomorrow, but sometime soon, these lands in Western Ukraine will probably end up being Polish, Hungarian, Romanian, again, Slovakian. A lot of people became very upset over that, and you had the Poles say, oh no, we want nothing to do with that. But in truth, he's going once again back to something that we in the United States ignore at our peril, and that is history and culture and language and people, identity. And I remember during the Kosovo Air Campaign, there was a question that came up about why both Serbs and Croats were so opposed to the rebuilding of a mosque in Banja Luka. And so I asked one of the German general staff officers, who incidentally is now a major general, he may be retired by now, very able man, and I said, help me out. I don't have time to research this myself, find out what the issue is. And he did, came back, wrote a very short paper, only a couple of pages long, handed it to me the next day, and sure enough, it turned out that the Banja Luka Mosque had been erected with the money that the population of Eastern Slavonia had collected to buy back the head of an Austrian nobleman who had commanded the defense of Eastern Slavonia against the Turks. This was in the early 1600s. And the sad part was that this particular man had been commanding that area for years. Everybody in Eastern Slavonia loved the man because he protected them from the Ottomans. and he unfortunately was killed in battle. And the Turks cut his head off and took it back, which they like to do, and sent it to the Sultan. And then said, if you want to bury this man, in with his full body, you're going to have to buy the head. So they collected several, pounds of gold and bought it. That gold paid for the creation of the mosque in Banja Luka. And the answer I got back from the people above me, the Americans at Supreme Headquarters of Light Powers Europe, says, well, this is ridiculous. That happened 300 or 400 years ago. Who cares about that? That doesn't mean anything. I said in the Balkans, that was yesterday. We don't understand Europeans. And so when President Putin made his comments, he was telling the truth. Most of what we call Ukraine was part of Polish Lithuania. In fact, before this, we were talking about Minsk. I have not been to Minsk, but there used to be a giant column that stood in Minsk, and it said in 3 languages, "Here begins Lithuania." Well, not anymore. But I'll guarantee if you go to Lithuania, the Lithuanians are well aware of that. And Polish Lithuania dominated Ukraine, is what we call Ukraine. And when he says that Ukraine was not a nation state, he's not wrong. It was more of a region. And it was usually fragmented or split between the East Bank, West Bank, or what they used to call right bank, left bank Cossacks. It's a very complex part of the world. But his point is, the people that are living on the terrain now today in many of these areas are not Ukrainians. And I know especially the Hungarians that are living there would very much like to rejoin Hungary and get out from underneath the Ukrainians. I'm sure some Poles feel the same way. I'm not advocating the systematic dismantlement of Ukraine, though I think at some point it's probably going to happen because it's happened before. And what we don't understand in the United States is this is how you create peace. This is how you create solutions. You make these decisions. We made a series of bad decisions at the end of World War II. We left too much of it to Stalin, and he created a monster. And by the way, Putin effectively said that. He created this construct called Ukraine. Why? Because it's false. It's not real. It's not historically accurate. And a friend of mine was just telling me, who came back recently from Europe, that I guess there was a demonstration put on somewhere by Ukrainians. They ran into one of the towns. I think it may be Konstantinovka. I don't speak the language, so I may have pronounced that wrong. And they put up some Ukrainian flags and took pictures. So they could send this to the media and say, well, the town really isn't in Russian hands. So the Russians showed up. They all stopped and surrendered. And the Russians said, what are you doing? He said, well, we were told to come over and do this. So we did it. He said, well, what do you want to do? He said, well, what we really want to do is surrender. And so they surrendered to the Russians, and they pointed out the Russians treated them very well. And they all said, look, we're all sick of this war. This needs to end. We need to stop killing each other. I think that sentiment is very strong, but it doesn't reach the White House. It doesn't reach Paris. It doesn't reach Berlin. It doesn't reach London. It needs to, but it doesn't. And the media are complicit with the governments. And the governments are in the hands of these globalists. And these are the same people driving the wars in both locations. And by the way, they're also behind what is effectively economic warfare against China. So I don't have an easy answer, but I think it's all going to collapse because we're broke.
Yeah, I always thought that a peace would have to be, well, because the Europeans have essentially, the boycotting diplomacy. So I always thought that a peace in Ukraine would have to be established between Moscow and the US, but it's just there's nothing. There's no losses for the NATO countries though, so there's not that much motivation for ending this. I mean, if the Ukrainians kill one Russian, the Russian kill 5 Ukrainians, there's a 0 loss for NATO. So it's not that pressure to put an end to this. I'm just thinking but at the same time, there's no willingness in Kiev under Zelensky either to find some kind of a deal. I know that once the Russians went in, in 2022, within the first few days, Zelensky had agreed to meet with the Russians to discuss neutrality. He had made his points that we also perhaps need a deal that recognizes Russian security interests, things which would be unthinkable to discuss today. But today, I don't think it's possible for Zelensky to discuss these things. But it only leaves military victory left on the table, it seems, which is very depressing. Yeah, I don't know. I still think if anyone would have told me 20 years ago that Ukrainians and Russians would be killing each other in the hundreds of thousands, it would be very hard to believe this. Um, but if we take a step back, you mentioned before that Sykes-Picot is over. That will be a new Middle East. How do you look at it in terms of Europe, though? Because how will, as this is over, we see now Russia, it's not over yet, but we will see Russia, China play a very different role. The Europeans and Americans will probably be a bit more fragmented. At least the political West won't look like it did in the past. How do you see essentially the world being shaped by these wars?
I think we and the Europeans are going to have to turn inward and focus on all of the terrible problems that we have created for ourselves inside our own societies. And I know that very few people look at things from that standpoint. Nobody likes to say we are the authors of our own destruction, but we're all going to have to look at the policies of the past 30, 40 years that have brought us to this point in time. The Europeans are going to have to deal with all these vast numbers of unwanted migrants, people that came in starting in 2015 that the Europeans were never asked about. They were never consulted. There was no plebiscite. Now they're stuck. And it gets worse with each passing day. We now have demonstrations in Spain over a recent decision to admit more people that the Spaniards do not want in their country. I think this is going to have to be addressed. And we have a similar problem in the United States. Millions have streamed into our country under Biden and under some of his predecessors, but certainly what happened under Biden was unprecedented. Those things have to be dealt with, and those pose existential questions for us and our societies. What do we want? I mean, somebody talked to me the other day, said, Doug, the problem is we have tried to get Americans to focus on all of these unnecessary wars and interventions overseas for many years by identifying whatever we were doing with human rights and democracy. He said, you and I know that's all nonsense. I said, of course. He said, Americans are beginning to figure it out. They now know that they were essentially deceived, lied to. I think Europeans are going to reach the same conclusion, and I think you'll see something in the West on the scale of the revolutions of 1848. Now, those revolutions did not achieve their aims because at the time the governments were strong and they didn't have to make many compromises, and they could use the armed forces and the police against the people. This time around is going to be tougher. The governments are not strong, and I think that's another reason why the wars overseas receive so much attention. If they can create the perception of conflict and crisis, that keeps them in power, extends them in power. How long can you live in a country like Germany, which has been a leader in the world in scientific industrial terms and built, in my judgment, a very successful and fabulous society after World War II? You can't expect that to be destroyed and no one to do anything. But there's another aspect, and you sort of pointed to this earlier. Something given has no value. If you don't earn it, you don't appreciate it. The people that rebuilt Europe after World War II in Germany, they understood what they were doing. They appreciated the criticality of the task in front of them, and they were devoted to their country, and they rebuilt it. They've passed. They're gone in overwhelming numbers. The people that are there now are the beneficiaries in many respects of what was done, but they've also become the victims of dumb policies, destructive policies, some of which they voted for and some of which they did not. Now they have to deal with reality, but they didn't build it. They're just living in it. Now they know how important it is, how they must now fight for it if it is to survive. And I think that's true all over Scandinavia. I think it's true everywhere. It's true in the United States. My generation built nothing. It consumed. Well, the consumption is about to end. So the building has to begin. We're going to have to build something new because what we built in the past is no longer applicable to our needs today. That may be true in Europe as well. That's why I think these wars, these conflicts will end for reasons of finance and economics more than anything else. And I'm not demeaning or disparaging the achievements of the Iranians, for God's sakes, who had stood up successfully against an enormous military power. Nor am I disparaging the Russian military achievement. I'm simply saying that inside the West, the United States and the West, I think it's going to happen to some extent in Japan and Korea. Korea just shut down its stock market yesterday. That's just the beginning of emergencies that we're going to face in the future. You're going to see bank runs. You're going to see all the things that we've seen in the past and worse. But these things we'll have to deal with internally will suddenly make everything that's happening beyond our borders irrelevant.
Yeah, no, that's a good point. This the external conflicts do distract us now, but again, that fits in with what you said before about this train collapse because the economic crisis it can't really be avoided anymore. And I think anyone taking a serious look at the economy, debt levels, energy problems, yeah, across the board, recognize that this is not sustainable. It's going to come to, it's going to crash. But as you said, the people don't seem to want to hear of it until the crisis is actually here. But do you see a timeline here, or how do you? Well, what indicators are you looking at in terms of when this crisis will hit?
Well, I sat in a discussion the other day with some very bright people talking about AI. And they were talking, these are people involved in the technology, not people selling stock. And they were talking about the bubble that's about to burst. And they pointed out nobody seems to understand that AI consumes enormous energy. Where's the energy coming from? You know, and if you want to build, you have to have credit. You've got to be able to borrow. Well, cheap credit and cheap energy are inseparable. And those two things have been the foundation for our economic expansion on the North American continent, I would argue, for over 100 years. So where do we go when we don't have it? When energy isn't cheap and credit isn't cheap, everything stops. We have to start over. So I think that's coming. Timeline, I think we'll know by Christmas. We'll see a lot of these things come to fruition this fall. And from that point onward, it's just going to get worse for a while. And people are going to vote in new prime ministers, new presidents, new governments, and they're not going to get anywhere because they don't know what they're doing. And suddenly there's going to be a demand for competence. Now, I don't know how you vote in Norway, what people look for, but in the United States, it's a popularity contest. Why'd you vote for Bill Clinton? Oh, I think he's a really nice guy. He understands. Well, why'd you vote for Donald Trump? Well, he says stuff I agree with. He just says it out loud. Why'd you vote for Obama? Well, he seemed like a nice guy, easygoing, somebody I could talk to. I mean, I could go on and on, all right? I sat with people that met with Hitler, and I said, what was it about the man? And everybody said the same thing. Oh, that was a man you could talk to. Okay, great. But at some point, competence is critical. You've got to have people that know what the hell they're doing. And you've got to have people that are going to enforce the law. Because one of the things that's relaxed across the Western world is law. We let people get away with all sorts of things that our ancestors 100 years ago would have hanged them for. So we got a long way to go. It's going to take us years to recover. But by this fall, it's going to be pretty obvious where we are. And there's no easy fix. You're not going to manipulate your way out of it. Look, the strategic petroleum reserves, they're drying up. There are people very upset with Trump. They're afraid that they're going to be dried up to the point where we can no longer use them. especially these underground salt mines. I don't know. I'm not in there. I don't have access to that information. But I hear these things all the time. We start talking about microcircuitry and the requirements for the microchips that we desperately need, not just for the military, to run our entire economy. Then you look at the power grids that we've neglected for years. We could go on and on. All of these things are suddenly going to become very, very important. And as I said, then nobody will care what happens overseas. People that talk about that will be shunned. And a lot of the people that have brought us to this point, who are responsible for the financial disaster, responsible for these pointless wars that have drained our treasuries, they're going to be held accountable.
I was going to say, let's hope so. I think a key problem in Europe is how passive people are. That is, especially in places like Germany, where the collapse have already begun, and you simply have Merz going on TV saying, "Oh, well, this is the new normal," and there seems to be some acceptance of it. Well, the opposition is clearly taking over, but nonetheless, it's. I'm a bit surprised people haven't taken to the streets, to be honest. Anyways, thank you so much for your time and your insights, and yeah, let's hope for better days.
Absolutely, Glenn.